Hello and welcome. Tonight, we drift away from the world of battles, reforms, and grand ideologies. Instead, we're journeying into a quieter, stranger corner of history, a place where the lines between governance and madness blur into a single, surreal portrait. We are venturing into the minds of those who held absolute power, not as a responsibility, but as a license to indulge their deepest, most bizarre compulsions. Forget the tales of noble kings and wise queens. The stories you're about to hear are different. They are about the jesters who wore crowns, the children who commanded empires, and the lost souls who turned their kingdoms into private theaters of the absurd. Imagine for a moment that every whim, every fleeting thought, every strange desire you ever had could become national policy. Imagine your dreams and your nightmares could be made real with a simple wave of your hand. What would you become? Power doesn't always corrupt in the ways we expect. Sometimes it doesn't forge a tyrant. It simply untethers a person from reality. It lets the quiet eccentricities that live within us all grow unchecked until they consume everything. So, dim the lights. Let the sounds of your world fade into a gentle hum. Let's travel back together, not to witness greatness, but to explore the profound, often hilarious, and deeply unsettling strangeness that lies on the other side of the throne. Our journey begins not with a roar, but with a quiet click, the sound of a pocket watch, resting in a palm where it does not belong. We begin in Egypt, in the early 20th century. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and revolution. But inside the marbled halls of Abdeen Palace, the world is a playground for a boy king. His name is Farouk, and when he ascended to the throne at just 16, he was the hope of a nation. Young, handsome, and charismatic, he was meant to lead Egypt into a bold new future. But Farouk wasn't interested in the future. He was interested in things, beautiful things, shiny things, things that belonged to other people. His reign did not begin with grand decrees or sweeping reforms. It began with a quiet, obsessive hobby. Farouk was a collector. He collected stamps, a pursuit of kings. He collected coins, an interest of scholars. He collected antique cars, Faberge eggs, and rare gems. His palaces became vast museums of his appetites, rooms overflowing with the treasures of the world. But acquiring things legally, with the bottomless purse of a king, soon became boring. The thrill wasn't in the having, it was in the taking. And so, the king of Egypt became a thief. It started small, a stolen ceremonial sword from the Shah of Iran's coffin, a quiet lift of a precious artifact from a nobleman's home during a state dinner. He had a tutor, a slick Italian man named Antonio Poli, who taught him the finer points of picking pockets. Imagine that, a king who owned the very ground his people walked on, learning how to perform a petty street crime with the elegance of a magician. His state visits became shopping sprees where nothing was for sale and everything was for the taking. His most famous, most audacious theft was from a man who embodied the very notion of power. Picture the scene: a smoke-filled room in Cairo during the height of the Second World War. The fate of the world hangs in the balance. Churchill, a bulldog of a man, weary from the burdens of command, checks his pocket watch. It's a magnificent gold piece, a gift he treasured. He sets it on the table. Beside him, the young King Farouk, his host, engages him in conversation, all charm and deference. He asks about the war, about strategy, about the future of their nations. But his eyes, they keep drifting to the watch. His fingers twitch in a moment of distraction. With a smooth, practiced motion, the watch vanishes. It slips from the polished wood of the table into the king's silken pocket. Later, when Churchill realized it was gone, a quiet, frantic search began. Egyptian officials, mortified, knew exactly who the culprit was. A diplomatic mission was dispatched, not with threats, but with a delicate face-saving request. The watch, they explained to the king, must have been accidentally misplaced, and its return was a matter of honor. Farouk, with the nonchalant air of a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, eventually returned it, offering no apology, only a faint, knowing smile. He hadn't needed the watch. He had just wanted the thrill of possessing it. For a few moments, the secret knowledge that he had taken something from the most powerful man in the world. This was his version of statecraft, not the building of alliances, but the acquisition of trinkets. He had a recurring nightmare that he was being chased by lions. He woke up screaming, convinced the beasts were real. To conquer this fear, he went to the Cairo Zoo one night, took out a pistol, and personally shot 2 lions in their cage. The next morning, the zookeepers arrived to find the kings of the savannah lying dead, a bizarre monument to a king's fragile ego. He wasn't just collecting objects anymore. He was collecting experiences, collecting moments of power, however fleeting or pathetic. He ruled a nation on the brink of change, a crossroads of the ancient and modern worlds, and he saw it all as a giant curio cabinet, a source for his ever-expanding collection of sensations. The whispers in the palace corridors grew louder. They didn't speak of tyranny or cruelty. They spoke of something almost more unsettling, a profound, all-consuming emptiness housed in the body of a king. But a man cannot fill the void inside him with gold watches and dead lions alone. Another hunger began to stir in King Farouk, a craving far more primal and insatiable than his desire for shiny objects. As his collection of treasures swelled, so did his body. The handsome boy king, the hope of a nation, began to disappear, buried under layers of a new kind of acquisition. He was now collecting calories. His days became a relentless procession of meals. Breakfast was not a simple affair, but a feast of eggs, meats, breads, and imported jams. Lunch was a multi-course banquet that could last for hours. Dinner was an even grander spectacle. And between these monumental meals, he snacked constantly. He had a particular fondness for fizzy drinks and was known to consume up to 30 bottles of orange soda and champagne a day. The sound of a popping cork became the soundtrack of his reign. His pockets, once filled with stolen trinkets, were now stuffed with chocolates, pistachios, and Turkish delight. He would sit through tedious meetings of state, his ministers discussing policy and budgets, while his attention was focused entirely on the steady rhythm of his own chewing. He sent royal agents across the globe, not to forge treaties, but to procure rare delicacies, oysters from Copenhagen, cheeses from Switzerland, beef from Scotland. The national treasury was plundered to satisfy a palate that knew no limits. His personal kitchen staff numbered in the hundreds, working around the clock to feed the ever-expanding monarch. He once devoured a wartime meal intended for an entire platoon of soldiers, just as an afternoon snack. He ate with a desperate, frantic energy, as if he were trying to physically consume the world he was supposed to be ruling. The transformation was shocking. The slender, athletic youth vanished. In his place was a man of immense size, weighing well over 300 pounds. His custom-made suits could no longer conceal his bulk. His face, once sharp and handsome, became a puffy, bloated mask, his eyes sinking into fleshy folds. He moved with the heavy, labored gait of a man carrying an immense burden, and in a way, he was carrying the weight of his own relentless appetites. He became a prisoner in his own palace, not by decree, but by sheer inertia. He was too large, too tired, too consumed with the logistics of his next meal to bother with the tedious business of governing. When he traveled, he did so in a custom-built red Mercedes, one of the only cars that could comfortably accommodate his frame. He would tour the streets of Cairo, not to inspect his kingdom, but to find new restaurants. He would enter an establishment, his massive presence silencing the room, and proceed to order one of everything on the menu, methodically working his way through the list. As the stunned staff looked on, he paid with handfuls of jewels or gold coins, treating his country's wealth like play money. The people of Egypt, struggling with poverty and political unrest, watched this slow-motion implosion with a mixture of anger and pity. Their king was no longer a leader. He was a caricature, a symbol of obscene indulgence in a starving nation. The title the public gave him was no longer His Majesty. It was simply the stomach with a head. The boy who had wanted to possess the world was now being possessed by his own body. The quiet thrill of stealing a watch had been replaced by the roaring, desperate need to feed a hunger that no amount of food could ever quell. His reign, which had begun with the promise of a new dawn, was now sinking into a long, gluttonous twilight, a slow, decadent feast at the edge of a revolution. We leave behind the shores of Egypt and travel north, across the shimmering Mediterranean and deep into the heart of medieval Europe. We arrive in 14th century France, a kingdom that for a brief, hopeful moment seemed to be bathed in a golden light. Its king was Charles VI, and in the early years of his reign, he was known by a single telling title, the Beloved. He was everything a kingdom could wish for. He was intelligent, just, and pious. He dismissed his uncle's corrupt counsel and surrounded himself with wise advisors. He lowered taxes, sought peace with England, and earned the genuine affection of his people. The kingdom sighed in collective relief. It felt as if a long, dark winter had finally given way to a sun-drenched spring. But the human mind, even a king's, can be a fragile and treacherous landscape. The first sign that something was wrong came on a sweltering summer day in the year 1392. The king was leading a military expedition, riding through the Le Mans forest. The air was heavy and still. Sunlight, filtered through the thick canopy of leaves, dappled the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The only sounds were the soft thud of horses' hooves on the dirt path and the clinking of armor. It was a scene of perfect, almost sleepy, tranquility. Then, a sudden noise. A page drowsy from the heat dropped a lance, which clattered against a steel helmet. The sharp, metallic sound sliced through the quiet air. For the men in the procession, it was a minor, startling event. But for King Charles, that sound was a key turning a lock in his mind, opening a door to a terrifying new reality. His eyes, which moments before had been calm, went wide with a wild, feral terror. The faces of his lifelong friends and loyal knights, men who had sworn their lives to him, suddenly became the masks of monstrous traitors. In his mind, the dappled sunlight became a web of conspiracy, the quiet forest a nest of assassins. He drew his sword. A scream tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unreasoning fury. He spurred his horse, not forward toward an enemy, but backward into his own escort. The first to fall was his own brother, Louis of Orleans, who barely escaped with a deep gash in his arm. Then the king turned on his knights. These were men he had grown up with, men he had knighted, men he trusted implicitly, but he no longer saw them. He saw only enemies, their faces twisted into demonic sneers. For nearly an hour, The King of France, the beloved, was a whirlwind of destruction. He cut down 4 of his own men, his sword a blur of steel and blood, his screams echoing through the silent trees. His men were paralyzed with a terrible choice. They could not strike back at their king, their anointed sovereign, but they could not let him continue this slaughter. Finally, his chamberlain managed to sneak up behind him and wrestle him from his horse. The king fell to the ground, his body limp, his eyes vacant. The fury was gone, replaced by a deep, impenetrable emptiness. He had fallen into a coma. The procession that had ridden into the forest with such purpose and hope now carried their unconscious king back to the castle. A silent, somber cortege. The golden spring of his reign was over. A long, strange, and terrifying winter had begun. Charles had not just lost his senses, he had lost himself, and in doing so, he had plunged his entire kingdom into a shadow from which it would not emerge for a generation. When King Charles awoke from the coma that followed his violent fit in the forest, he was no longer Charles the Beloved. He was a stranger to himself and to his court, a man haunted by a new and terrifying reality. His madness was not constant. It came in waves, great tides of delusion that would sweep over him for months at a time, followed by periods of lucid, heartbreaking remorse. It was during these dark tides that the most famous and fragile of his delusions took hold. The King of France, the ruler of one of Europe's most powerful nations, became convinced that he was made of glass. This was not a metaphor. He believed it with every fiber of his being. He looked at his own hands and saw not flesh and bone, but a delicate, transparent material, shimmering and brittle. He felt a profound, chilling vulnerability, the constant, terrifying awareness that he could shatter at any moment. His world, once a place of solid, predictable reality, became a minefield of potential disasters. A careless touch, a sudden jolt, an embrace from his wife, any of these could be the impact that would splinter him into 1,000 glittering shards. His life became a series of bizarre and desperate precautions against this imaginary fragility. He refused to be touched. Courtiers learned to give him a wide berth, to move around him with the slow, deliberate grace of someone navigating a room full of priceless, delicate sculptures. He would often stand for hours, motionless, fearing that the simple act of sitting down would put too much pressure on his crystalline form and cause him to crack. To further protect his body, he had special clothes designed. Iron rods were sewn into his garments, forming a kind of external skeleton, a rigid cage to shield the delicate glass man who lived inside. Imagine the sight: a king shuffling through the cold stone halls of the Louvre, encased in a strange clanking armor, his eyes wide with the fear of a sudden sound, a clumsy servant, a gust of wind. His terror was absolute. He would spend days locked in his chambers, refusing to let anyone enter, convinced that the slightest vibration could bring about his end. He would pad the walls with cushions and blankets, creating a soft, muffled world where nothing hard, nothing sharp, nothing solid could reach him. The Kingdom of France, a nation of sprawling lands and fierce warriors, was now being ruled by a man who lived in mortal fear of a light breeze. And in a strange, tragic way, his delusion became a prophecy for his kingdom. A nation ruled by a man who believed he could shatter at any moment began to feel just as fragile itself. The periods of his lucidity became shorter, the waves of madness longer and more profound. During these times, he would forget his own name. He wouldn't recognize his wife or his children, running from them in terror as if they were strangers. He would howl like a wolf through the corridors of the palace, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the decay of his own mind and the growing chaos in his realm. His court, once a center of power and order, devolved into a nest of feuding factions, each vying for control over the vacant throne. The country began to crack along the seams, mirroring the imaginary fissures the king saw in his own body. The 100 Years' War with England, which he had so skillfully brought to a truce, reignited with a vengeance. France, leaderless and broken, suffered a series of devastating defeats, most famously at the Battle of Agincourt. The king, who was made of glass, presided over the shattering of his own kingdom, a fragile monarch for a fractured age. We travel now from the cold, splintering courts of France to the opulent, suffocating heart of the Ottoman Empire. We arrive in the 17th century at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a sprawling labyrinth of courtyards, chambers, and secrets. Here, deep within the imperial harem, was a unique and terrible institution known as the cafes, or the cage. It was not a cage of iron bars, but one of gilded walls and marbled floors. It was a luxurious prison designed to hold the brothers and potential heirs of the reigning sultan. Here they lived in splendid isolation, surrounded by deaf-mute servants, their days a monotonous cycle of meals, prayers, and waiting either for the throne or for the bowstring of the royal executioners, who could arrive at any moment without warning. For 22 years, this was the entire world of a prince named Ibrahim. From the age of 2, he lived in the cafes, under the reign of his formidable and ruthless older brother, Sultan Murad IV. Murad was a man of action, a warrior who had executed 4 of his other brothers to secure his throne. Ibrahim was the last one left. He lived every single day in the shadow of death. Every meal could be his last. Every footstep in the corridor could be the approach of his assassins. He grew up in a silent, paranoid world. His only companions, the mute servants and the beautiful, but equally powerless, concubines sent to entertain him. His emotional growth was stunted, frozen by a constant, paralyzing fear. He was a man in body, but a terrified child in mind. Then, in 1640, Sultan Murad died. The doors of the cafes were thrown open. The Grand Vizier and the highest officials of the empire came to Ibrahim and told him that he was now the Sultan, the absolute ruler of a vast and powerful domain. But Ibrahim did not react with joy or relief. He reacted with sheer terror. He was convinced it was a trick, a final, cruel test from his brother to see if he harbored any ambition. He refused to come out. He barricaded the door of his chamber, screaming that he would rather stay in the safety of his cage than fall for their trap. The officials were desperate. The empire could not be without a ruler. Finally, they had to bring the body of his dead brother Murad and hold it up to the door so that Ibrahim could see for himself that his tormentor was truly gone. Only then did he emerge, blinking in the unfamiliar light. A man-child of 25, who had known nothing but fear and confinement, suddenly thrust into a position of absolute, limitless power. The transition was instantaneous and catastrophic. A mind so long compressed by terror, when suddenly released, did not expand into wisdom or responsibility. It exploded into madness. The boy who had spent 2 decades in a gilded cage was now the master of the entire Ottoman world, and he was determined to turn it into a playground for the appetites and anxieties that had festered in the dark for so long. The empire held its breath. The quiet, trembling prisoner was now the Sultan, and his first acts would be to try and fill the deep, echoing void that the cage had carved into his soul. The man who emerged from the cafes was a vessel of strange and insatiable cravings. Having been denied the world for so long, he now sought to consume it, to wrap himself in its textures, to indulge its every sensation with a desperate, childish urgency. His first obsession was with fur. He became infatuated with the feel of sable, demanding that the walls and floors of his chambers be lined with the most expensive pelts. He would sit for hours, running his hands over the soft, dark fur, a simple, tactile pleasure that seemed to soothe the frantic anxieties that still echoed from his years in the cage. He wore robes so heavy with sable that he could barely move, a walking monument to his own sensory indulgence. But his greatest obsession lay within the walls of the harem, the very place that had been both his comfort and his prison. He now had absolute control over this world of women, and he began to reshape it according to his increasingly bizarre tastes. He developed a fixation on large, heavy-set women. He sent his agents to the far corners of the empire with a single, strange command: to find the fattest woman possible. They eventually found an Armenian woman of immense proportions, whom Ibrahim nicknamed Seker Pear, or Sugar Cube. He became utterly infatuated with her, showering her with titles and wealth, and promoting her to the highest position in the harem. His preference became law, and soon the court was filled with women who cultivated their size to please their sultan. His days were spent in the amber courtyard, a pleasure garden where he would watch his concubines perform for him, rewarding them with handfuls of gold coins. His nights were a blur of decadent feasts and elaborate games, but beneath the surface of this hedonistic paradise, the old paranoia of the cage still lingered. His mind, incapable of trust, saw shadows and conspiracies everywhere. The harem, his ultimate playground, could also become his ultimate threat. One day, a whisper reached him, a rumor from a disgruntled servant that one of his concubines had been unfaithful, that a stranger had somehow breached the sacred walls of the harem. For a stable mind, this would have been a matter for quiet investigation. For Ibrahim, a man whose reality was already fractured, this single whisper of betrayal was a spark that ignited a firestorm of paranoia. He didn't question the source. He didn't seek proof. In his mind, the single act of one became the collective guilt of all. The entire harem was tainted, polluted. The source of his greatest pleasure had become the source of his greatest fear. He made a decision of such monstrous, sweeping cruelty that it has echoed through history as an act of pure madness. He decided to cleanse his world. That night, under the cloak of darkness, he ordered his chief eunuchs to round up his entire harem, nearly 300 women. The girls he had played games with, the women who had borne him children, his favorites and his forgotten ones, were bound, placed into weighted sacks, and loaded onto boats. The boats were rowed out into the middle of the Bosphorus, the dark, swirling strait that separates Europe and Asia. There, one by one, the sacks were thrown into the cold, black water. The only sounds were the soft splash of the bodies hitting the surface, followed by a terrible, final silence as they were pulled down into the depths. The next morning, the Sultan awoke to a silent, empty harem. He had purged the shadows. He had erased the perceived stain on his honor with an act of mass murder. He felt no remorse. He simply began again, ordering his agents to find new women, to build him a new collection, as if the hundreds of lives he had extinguished were nothing more than broken toys that had been swept away. The boy from the cage, who had lived in constant fear of a single bowstring, had become a man who could command the deaths of hundreds with a single whispered word. His power was absolute, his madness complete, and the waters of the Bosphorus held his darkest secret. We now leave the gilded cages of Istanbul and travel east, across deserts and mountains, to the heart of 16th century China, to the sprawling, crimson-walled fortress known as the Forbidden City. Here, Behind layers of gates and guards lived the Son of Heaven, the absolute ruler of the Ming dynasty. The emperor who sat on the dragon throne during this time was named Zhu Hoshao, known to history as the Zhengde Emperor, and he was, perhaps, one of the most reluctant emperors who ever lived. He did not want to be a divine ruler. He did not want to sit through endless, tedious ceremonies or listen to the droning advice of his gray-bearded Confucian ministers. What he wanted, with all the petulant energy of a spoiled child, was to play. His reign began with a profound declaration of boredom. The vast, majestic halls of the Forbidden City, with their rigid etiquette and crushing responsibilities, felt not like a palace, but like a prison. He needed an escape. So, just outside the palace walls, he ordered the construction of a place that would become the true center of his world. It was called the Baofeng, or the Leopard House. The name was both literal and deeply misleading. It was not just a place for leopards, though he did keep them there, along with tigers, bears, and other exotic beasts. The Leopard House was something far more complex and bizarre. It was a palace within a palace, a personal fantasy world built to the emperor's exact specifications. Imagine a sprawling complex of buildings, connected by secret passageways and hidden courtyards. One section was a zoo, filled with the roars and cries of wild animals. Another was a fully functioning brothel, staffed with beautiful women, musicians, and performers sourced from across the empire. A third section was a Tibetan-style lamasery, where the emperor and his favorite eunuchs would engage in esoteric Buddhist rituals, which often devolved into drunken orgies. And another part still was a military headquarters, a command center from which the emperor could direct his imaginary campaigns. The Leopard House was a microcosm of all his desires: the thrill of the hunt, the pleasure of the flesh, the mystery of the spirit, and the glory of the battlefield. It was his personal Disneyland, a place where he could be anyone he wanted to be, except the one thing: he was the Emperor of China. He would disappear into the Leopard House for months at a time, leaving the vast machinery of the state to grind to a halt. His ministers would send desperate memorials, begging him to return to the Forbidden City to attend to urgent matters of state: famines, rebellions, border crises. The memorials would pile up outside his door, unread. Inside, the emperor was busy. He might be learning to speak Mongolian from a captured chieftain, or composing a new song with a favorite courtesan, or watching a tiger fight a bear in his private arena. He created a shadow court within the Leopard House, a world of eunuchs, entertainers, and sycophants who catered to his every whim. Here, the rigid hierarchies of the outside world were inverted. A talented singer could hold more influence than a grand secretary. A skilled wrestler could have the emperor's ear, while a provincial governor waited for weeks for an audience that would never come. He was a master of disguise and role play. He would often dress up as a common merchant and set up a fake marketplace within the Leopard House. He would force his eunuchs and concubines to act as customers, haggling with him over the price of silks and spices. He would close the shop at the end of the day, immensely satisfied with his performance, feeling for a few hours that he had been someone else, someone free. This was not a king seeking to understand his people. This was a man trying desperately to escape himself. The Leopard House was more than just a place of debauchery. It was a fortress built against reality. And while the emperor played inside its walls, the real world, with its real problems, continued to press in, threatening to collapse the fragile fantasy he had so carefully constructed. The dragon throne in the Forbidden City sat empty and cold, while in a compound filled with the scent of incense, perfume, and wild animals, a reluctant emperor was pretending to be a shopkeeper. The emperor's games within the Leopard House soon grew too small for his boundless imagination. Pretending to be a merchant was one thing, but a deeper, more thrilling fantasy was taking hold in his mind. He didn't just want to play at life. He wanted to play at war. He had grown up on tales of great warrior emperors, of heroic charges and glorious victories. The tedious reality of his own protected life felt like a pale imitation. He craved the thrill of the battlefield, the glory of command, the identity of a hero. So, he decided to become one. He could not, as the Son of Heaven, simply march off to war. The risks were too great, the protocols too rigid. So, he invented an alter ego. He gave himself a new name, Su Shou, which translates to Zhu the Longevity, and he appointed this new persona to the position of General Mighty, the supreme commander of the armed forces. It was a breathtaking act of self-delusion. The Emperor of China was now officially his own top general. He would issue imperial decrees from the Dragon Throne, addressed to himself, General Zhu Shou, ordering him to lead campaigns and defend the frontiers. He would then change into his general's uniform, ride out of the palace, and accept the commission with great solemnity. The entire court was forced to play along with this elaborate, surreal charade. His first great campaign was in _1_51_7, when Mongol forces were raiding the northern border. This was a real and serious threat. But for the Zhengde Emperor, or rather for General Zhu Shou, it was a magnificent opportunity. He announced that he would lead the imperial army in person to repel the invaders. His ministers were horrified. They pleaded with him, reminding him of the disastrous precedent of a previous Mingde emperor who had been captured by the Mongols in a similar venture. But he would not be dissuaded. This was the role he had been born to play. He marched north with a massive army, not with the grim determination of a commander, but with the giddy excitement of a boy on an adventure. The journey was a prolonged festival. He ignored his military advisors, preferring to spend his time hunting, fishing, and staging elaborate banquets in his campaign tent. When they finally reached the front, the reality of war proved to be a thrilling spectacle. He would ride out to the front lines, not to direct strategy, but to get a better view of the action, often putting himself in immense danger, much to the terror of his bodyguards. In one famous incident during a battle, he became so engrossed in the fighting that he personally charged into the fray, cutting down a single enemy soldier. He was ecstatic. He returned to his camp, not as a victorious emperor, but as a triumphant warrior, boasting of his kill to anyone who would listen. He saw the battle not as a matter of national security, but as a personal test of his own courage. His most absurd tactic came later in the campaign. Frustrated that the Mongol forces were elusive and hard to pin down, he ordered his men to capture a group of them. Then, in a grand staged event, he personally recaptured them from his own troops, declaring a great victory for which he, General Zhu Shou, was solely responsible. The war was no longer a conflict between nations. It was a backdrop for his personal epic, a stage on which he could live out his heroic fantasies. The soldiers fought and died. The borders remained under threat, but in the mind of the emperor, it was all a spectacular success. He returned to Beijing, not as a ruler who had secured his kingdom, but as a hero returning from his odyssey, ready for the next chapter in the fantastic story of General Zhu Shou. Our journey now takes us back in time, back to the heart of the Roman Empire. In the final years of the 2nd century AD, the empire was at its peak, a vast, stable, and prosperous world, governed by a man considered to be the ideal ruler, Marcus Aurelius. He was the philosopher king, a man of wisdom, restraint, and profound dedication to his duty. The Roman world felt secure under his steady hand, and when he died, he left the throne to his only surviving son, a young man named Commodus. Rome hoped for a continuation of the Golden Age. It expected another Aurelius. What it got was something else entirely. Commodus had grown up in his father's shadow, surrounded by stoic philosophy, military discipline, and the immense burdens of state. He had seen the toll that duty had taken on his father, the weary lines on his face, the weight in his eyes, and he wanted none of it. He did not share his father's love for philosophy or his dedication to the Roman people. His heart was not in the Senate house or on the battlefield. It was in the thrilling, blood-soaked world of the arena. He was fascinated by the gladiators, by their brute strength, their godlike physiques, and the deafening roar of the crowd that greeted their every move. While his father was writing his Meditations, a profound work of philosophy, Commodus was secretly practicing with the sword and the trident, dreaming of a different kind of glory. When he became emperor at the age of 18, he quickly put an end to the wars his father had been waging on the northern frontier. He wasn't interested in expanding the empire. He was interested in returning to Rome, to the life of luxury, pleasure, and performance that he craved. He saw himself not as a servant of the state, but as its star. The empire was not a responsibility to be shouldered, but a stage to be commanded. And the greatest stage in the entire world was the Colosseum. He began to spend more and more of his time with gladiators, wrestlers, and charioteers. He admired their physical prowess and their celebrity status far more than he did the cautious wisdom of the senators. He saw himself as one of them, a physical specimen of unmatched perfection, a god among mortals. He began to cultivate an image of himself as the reincarnation of the demigod Hercules. He had statues of himself commissioned that depicted him in the guise of Hercules, complete with a lion skin headdress and a club. He even officially renamed the city of Rome, Colonia Commodiana, in his own honor. This was not just vanity. It was a deep-seated belief in his own divinity, a belief that would lead him to his most outrageous and shocking act. He was not content to simply look like a god or be worshipped as one. He wanted to perform as one. The whispers started in the palace, then spread through the city, carried on waves of disbelief and horror. The emperor, the sacred ruler of the Roman world, was going to step into the arena. He was going to fight as a gladiator. For the Roman elite, this was an unthinkable degradation of his office. A gladiator was a slave, a condemned criminal, a social outcast. For the emperor to place himself on their level was to defile the very majesty of Rome itself. But Commodus did not care for their opinions. He cared only for the roar of the crowd. The day finally came. The Colosseum was packed, the crowd buzzing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. And then he appeared, emerging from the gladiator's gate into the bright sunlight of the arena. But he was not dressed as an emperor. He was bare-chested, his muscular physique oiled and gleaming, wearing the lion skin of Hercules. In his hand, he held not a scepter, but a sword. The crowd, a mix of commoners who were thrilled by the spectacle and senators who were horrified by it, erupted in a carefully orchestrated cheer. His opponents were not a fair match. He did not face seasoned, battle-hardened gladiators. Instead, he fought against terrified amateurs, men chosen to provide a spectacle of the emperor's prowess without posing any actual threat. He would also engage in beast hunts, a popular form of entertainment. But again, the odds were stacked impossibly in his favor. He would stand on a protected platform and with a bow and arrow, shoot down helpless animals, giraffes, ostriches, elephants, that had been released into the arena below. In one particularly grotesque display, He had a group of wounded soldiers and amputees, men who had lost limbs fighting for the empire, tied together. He then clubbed them to death, pretending they were giants from a mythological tale. He fought in the arena hundreds of times. Each appearance was a grand piece of theater, and for each performance, he charged the Roman treasury an exorbitant fee of 1,000,000 sesterces, bankrupting the state to fund his own vanity. The Senate was forced to watch, to applaud his pathetic victories, and to officially record his divine achievements. They watched as their emperor, the son of the great Marcus Aurelius, made a mockery of his office, of his father's legacy, and of Rome itself. He had abandoned the role of philosopher-king for that of a stage performer. He was no longer a ruler protecting his people, but an actor demanding their applause, even if he had to purchase it with the empire's wealth and dignity. He stood in the center of the world's greatest stage, a god in his own mind, a fool in the eyes of history, basking in the artificial light of a glory he had not earned, but simply staged. Our journey now leaps forward in time. Leaving the ancient world behind, we travel across centuries of dust and upheaval, past the rise and fall of countless empires, and arrive in a landscape that feels both modern and strangely timeless. The vast, sun-scorched deserts of Central Asia. It is the late 20th century, and the Soviet Union has crumbled, leaving a collection of new nations to find their way in the world. One of these is Turkmenistan, a country rich in natural gas and ancient traditions, and for 21 years, it was the personal fiefdom of a man who would elevate the cult of personality to an art form of breathtaking absurdity. His name was Sapar Murat Niyazov, but he insisted the world call him by another title, one he bestowed upon himself, Turkmenbashi, the leader of all ethnic Turkmens. Niyazov was a former Soviet apparatchik, a man trained in the gray, predictable world of communist bureaucracy. But when he found himself the absolute ruler of an independent nation, something bloomed within him. It was not a desire for democracy or a vision for economic reform. It was a desire for a strange, all-encompassing form of immortality. He did not want to be just a president. He wanted to be a prophet, a father, a living God for his people. And he began to remake his country, not with policies, but with symbols of his own greatness. The capital city, Ashgabat, once a drab Soviet provincial town, was transformed into a gleaming white marble metropolis, a surreal monument to his ego. The streets were lined with golden-domed palaces and fountains that danced to the rhythm of the national anthem. But the centerpiece of this new world was a structure that defied all logic, a monument of such spectacular vanity, it seemed to have been plucked from a dream. It was called the Neutrality Arch, a towering three-legged structure that rose over 250 feet into the desert sky. And perched atop this colossal tripod, arms outstretched to embrace his city, was a 40-foot tall statue of Turkmenbashi himself, and it was covered from head to toe in pure gold leaf. But that was not its most remarkable feature. The golden statue was not static. It was mounted on a gigantic mechanism that caused it to rotate slowly, once every 24 hours, so that the sun's rays would always be perfectly reflecting off his polished golden face, casting his benevolent gaze across his capital. Imagine the sight. As the real sun made its journey across the sky, this smaller golden sun followed it, a man-made star in a man-made heaven. The citizens of Ashgabat lived their lives under the constant glittering watch of their leader, his golden face a perpetual presence on the horizon, a silent, rotating testament to his own perceived divinity. This was only the beginning. His image was everywhere, on every banknote, on every bottle of vodka, on every box of tea. His face smiled down from the corner of every television broadcast, a permanent watermark on reality itself. Schools, airports, canals, and even a meteorite were named after him and members of his family. He was not just the leader of the country. He was its entire identity. He commissioned giant, mechanized portraits of himself that would open and close, revealing a video screen that played his speeches. He built a colossal walkthrough model of one of his own books, which would open its pages at night while a recording of his voice boomed out passages across the city square. He was building more than a dictatorship. He was building a religion with himself as its one and only deity. The people of Turkmenistan were no longer citizens in a republic. They were worshippers in a vast open-air temple, and the object of their devotion was a golden man who chased the sun. A god needs a holy book, a text to contain his wisdom, to guide his followers, and to replace all other forms of knowledge. And so, Turkmenbashi, the leader of all Turkmens, set out to write one. He called it the Ruhnama, or the Book of the Soul. It was not a work of political theory or a legal codex. It was a sprawling, rambling collection of his personal autobiography, revisionist Turkmen history, moral fables, and spiritual guidance. It was his thoughts, his memories, and his philosophies, bound together and declared to be the sacred center of Turkmen life. The Ruhnama was not merely recommended reading, it was mandatory. It became the primary text in every school in the country. Students spent more time studying its passages than they did mathematics, science, or literature. To get a driver's license, you had to pass an exam on the Ruhnama. To get a government job, you had to demonstrate a deep spiritual understanding of its teachings. It was read aloud on state television, its verses chanted at public ceremonies. Turkmenbashi declared that any student who read his book 3 times would automatically be granted entry into heaven. He had written his own scripture and promised his own salvation. With the Ruhnama as his guide, he began to redesign reality itself to fit his personal tastes. He felt that the traditional names for the months of the year were foreign and uninspired, so he renamed them. January was now called Turkmenbashi, after himself. April was named Gurbin Sultan, after his deceased mother. September was renamed Ruhnama in honor of his holy book. The entire nation was forced to adopt a new calendar, one that revolved around the leader's own personal history. His reforms grew ever more eccentric. He had a deep personal dislike for opera and ballet, which he considered unnecessary, so he banned them. He saw gold teeth as a sign of vanity and poor hygiene. He suggested that his people should chew on bones to strengthen their teeth instead, and discouraged dentists from using gold caps. He declared that car radios were a needless distraction. He banned them. He decreed that newsreaders should not wear makeup, as their natural Turkmen beauty was sufficient. He built a massive ice palace in the middle of one of the hottest deserts on Earth, simply because he felt his people should learn to skate. He was the nation's ultimate arbiter of taste, its sole philosopher, its chief historian, and its only spiritual guide. The rich, complex culture of the Turkmen people, a heritage stretching back centuries, was being systematically erased and replaced with the whims of a single man. The world of science, art, and history was flattened, bulldozed to make way for the singular, towering truth of the Ruhnama. He wasn't just controlling his people's actions. He was attempting to control their thoughts, their memories, their very sense of time and reality. He had created a nation in his own image, a world where every clock, every calendar, and every book reflected his own face. It was a hermetically sealed kingdom of the mind, a nation-sized cult, and at its center sat a man who had not just built a golden statue of himself, but had successfully turned an entire country into a living monument to his own soul. We retreat now from the surreal desert landscapes of Turkmenistan and journey back into the frozen heart of 16th century Russia. We arrive in a Moscow of wooden houses and onion-domed churches, a city huddled against the unforgiving cold, and on the throne sits a man who will come to embody the very soul of Russian autocracy, in all its brilliance and all its terror. He is Ivan I, the first ruler to be crowned as Tsar of all the Russias. History will give him a different name, a title that speaks not of his greatness, but of his dread, Ivan the Terrible. But the man was not always terrible. In the first half of his reign, he was a ruler of extraordinary vision and energy. He came to the throne as a young boy. His childhood, a brutal education in the treacherous politics of the Russian court, where powerful, feuding boyar families treated him like a pawn. He grew up lonely, suspicious, and acutely aware of the fragility of his own power. But when he finally came of age and took the reins of the state, he ruled with a startlingly modern and progressive hand. He was a reformer. He convened the first Russian parliament, the Zemsky Sobor. He commissioned a new, comprehensive legal code that standardized laws across his vast and disparate realm. He reformed the military, curbed the power of the corrupt regional governors, and introduced local self-government. He was a patron of the arts and oversaw the construction of one of Russia's most iconic buildings, the magnificent, candy-colored St. Basil's Cathedral. For a time, it seemed that Russia was on the verge of a golden age, guided by a wise and powerful young Tsar. He was also a man of deep, if complex, faith, and he was, by all accounts, deeply in love with his wife, Anastasia Romanovna. She was his anchor, his confidant, the one source of stability and warmth in his suspicious and turbulent world. But in 1560, after 13 years of marriage, Anastasia fell ill and died, and with her death, the light in Ivan's world went out. The balance in his mind, always precarious, was shattered. He did not see his wife's death as a natural tragedy. In his grief-stricken, paranoid mind, it was murder. He was convinced that the boyars, the old noble families he had spent his reign trying to subdue, had poisoned her. Her death was not an act of fate. It was an act of treason. The reformer was gone, consumed by a fire of grief and vengeance. The Tsar, who had sought to build a state based on law, now believed himself to be surrounded by a world of invisible enemies. The trust he had tentatively placed in his advisors curdled into a corrosive, all-consuming suspicion. He saw betrayal in every shadow, conspiracy in every whispered conversation. The wise ruler descended into a dark and terrifying place, and he would drag his entire kingdom down with him. The death of his beloved wife was the turning point, the moment that the brilliant young Tsar began his long, slow, and bloody transformation into Ivan the Terrible. The golden age was over. An age of terror was about to begin. In the grip of his sorrow and paranoia, Ivan IV retreated from the world. In the winter of 1564, he stunned his kingdom by abdicating the throne and disappearing from Moscow. The city was thrown into chaos. Without a Tsar, the government ceased to function. The people, who saw the Tsar as God's chosen representative on earth, were terrified. A massive procession of clergy and commoners made its way to his retreat, begging him to return. He agreed, but on one terrifying condition. He demanded the power to create his own personal state within the state, a domain that would be subject to his absolute, unquestioned authority, free from the interference of the church or the boyar council. He called this new territory the Oprichnina, which translates roughly to the land set apart. When he returned to Moscow, he was a changed man. His hair and beard had grown long and wild. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, now burned with a feverish messianic light. He had come back, not as a ruler, but as an instrument of God's wrath. He immediately began to implement his new order. He divided the entire Russian realm in two. Half would remain the Zemshina, the public land, to be run by the regular government. The other half, including some of the richest and most strategic districts, became the Oprichnina, his personal fiefdom, his laboratory of terror. To enforce his will within this new domain, he created a personal army, a brotherhood of loyal followers known as the Oprichniki. They were his new elite, a force of around 1,000 men, chosen not for their noble birth, but for their absolute, unquestioning loyalty to him. They dressed in the black robes of monks, turning the symbols of piety into a uniform of dread, and they adopted two terrifying symbols, which they hung from their saddles. The first was a dog's head, to symbolize their mission to sniff out and devour the enemies of the Tsar. The second was a broom, to symbolize their duty to sweep treason from the sacred soil of Russia. Imagine the sight of these men, a silent, black-clad army, riding through the snow-covered Russian countryside on their black horses. The only sounds were the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves, but their arrival in a town or on an estate meant only one thing: judgment was at hand. They were Avon's personal demons, his avenging angels. They had the power of life and death. They could seize lands, execute nobles, and torture anyone they suspected of disloyalty, all without trial or appeal. They were the law. The Oprichnina became a 7-year reign of terror. The Oprichniki descended upon the lands of the old boyar families, the very people Ivan blamed for his wife's death and for the betrayals of his youth. Estates were confiscated, families were exiled or executed, and a centuries-old aristocracy was systematically destroyed. But the terror did not stop with the nobility. It spread to the merchant class, to the clergy, and to entire cities. The most horrific episode was the sack of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan, convinced that the city was plotting to defect to Lithuania, led his Oprichniki on a month-long rampage of unimaginable brutality. Thousands of people, men, women, and children, were tortured and killed. They were roasted over fires, tied to sleighs, and dragged into the freezing river and hunted for sport. The city, one of Russia's oldest and richest, was left a smoking, depopulated ruin. During this time, Ivan himself retreated into a kind of dark, theatrical piety. He established a headquarters that he styled as a monastery, where he and his inner circle of Oprichniki would act as monks. They would attend long, elaborate church services, with Ivan himself acting as the abbot, fervently praying and chanting. But these periods of intense devotion would be followed by nights of depraved orgies and brutal torture sessions, often carried out in the same chambers where they had just been praying. He saw no contradiction in this. In his mind, he was a holy warrior, purging the land of sin. His violence was not murder. It was a sacred duty, a painful but necessary surgery to save the soul of Russia. The man who had once built St. Basil's Cathedral to the glory of God was now presiding over a kingdom of blood and fear, a holy terror of his own creation. Our journey takes us back to China, to a period of turmoil and division known as the Northern and Southern dynasties. It is the 6th century AD, a time when the great Han Empire is a distant memory, and the land is fractured into a patchwork of competing kingdoms. In the north, a new dynasty, the Northern Qi, has just been forged in the crucible of war. Its founding emperor is a man named Gao Yang, and for the first few years of his reign, he was everything a new dynasty could hope for. He was a man of two distinct and utterly contradictory halves. In the beginning, China saw only the first half, the brilliant, disciplined, and visionary statesman. Gao Yang was a formidable figure. He had come to power through a military coup, a man of action who understood the brutal calculus of war. But once on the throne, he proved to be a ruler of surprising wisdom and foresight. He centralized the government, breaking the power of the arrogant aristocratic clans that had long dominated the court. He sought out men of talent, regardless of their family background, and promoted them to high office. He listened to their counsel, and for a time heeded their warnings. He reformed the tax system, lightening the burden on the peasantry and filling the state granaries. He strengthened the army, personally leading his troops on campaigns that expanded and secured the borders of his new empire. He was a man of immense physical energy and a sharp, calculating mind. He would work tirelessly, poring over memorials and state documents late into the night. He was decisive, and in the early years, his decisions were almost always sound. He built a strong, stable, and prosperous state from the ashes of civil war. Foreign emissaries who came to his court were impressed by his dignity and intelligence. His people, weary from decades of chaos, saw him as a true son of heaven, a ruler who had restored order and purpose to the world. He was the perfect Confucian sovereign, a man who had mastered himself, and in doing so, had mastered his kingdom. He was the architect of a new golden age. But within this brilliant statesman, this master of order and discipline, another man was waiting, a darker self, a creature of pure, unrestrained impulse, was lying dormant. The first half of his reign was a testament to his incredible self-control. The second half would become a terrifying testament to what happens when that control is lost. The court, the kingdom, and China itself had seen the wise king. They were about to meet the beast, and the key that would unlock the cage was simple, common, and devastatingly effective. It was alcohol. It began slowly, a cup of wine at a state banquet, a drink to celebrate a military victory. But soon, the drinking was no longer confined to celebrations. It became a daily ritual, then an hourly necessity. The emperor, who had once been a model of discipline, began to drink with a desperate, all-consuming thirst. And as the alcohol flowed into him, the brilliant statesman, the wise ruler, the architect of order, simply dissolved. In his place emerged a creature of pure, violent, and terrifying impulse. The second half of Gao Yang had arrived. When he was drunk, which was now most of the time, he was no longer a man. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of chaotic energy. The carefully constructed etiquette of the court meant nothing to him. He would strip off his imperial robes and run naked through the halls of the palace, and sometimes through the streets of the capital city itself, his face painted with garish colors, a wild, laughing demon unleashed upon his own kingdom. His dignity was gone, replaced by a love for grotesque performance. He would sometimes carry a large saw and wander through the city, a monstrous parody of a carpenter. He would climb atop the highest towers of the palace and beat a drum, singing strange, incoherent songs to the moon. His cruelty, once held in check by his sharp political mind, now became a form of entertainment. He saw his subjects, even his highest ministers and closest family members, as props in his drunken theater of horror. He had a special large pan for frying people, and would threaten his courtiers with it for the slightest perceived offense. He once became convinced that a high-ranking minister was having an affair with one of his favorite concubines. He had the minister beheaded, but his rage was not satisfied. He then turned to the concubine, a woman he had professed to love, and in a fit of drunken fury beheaded her as well. Still, the madness was not spent. He took her thigh bone, cleaned it, and fashioned it into a crude stringed instrument, a gruesome pipa. That night, at a grand banquet, as his terrified court looked on, he held up the bone pipa, and with tears streaming down his face, began to play a mournful song for the woman he had just murdered, remarking on the beauty of the instrument her body had provided. His own family was not safe from his rages. He was deeply suspicious of his royal relatives, seeing them all as potential rivals. During one drunken feast, he pointed to his brother, the Prince of Shangshan, and asked him what was the greatest achievement of our glorious ancestor, the founder of our house. The prince, trying to flatter him, replied, "He overthrew the previous dynasty and took the throne." Gao Yang laughed, a chilling, mirthless sound. "No," he said, "his greatest achievement was that he had no worthy heirs to overthrow him." He then ordered his guards to seize his brother and had him torn to pieces by his own men. His violence was unpredictable, almost artistic in its cruelty. He once asked his mother what it felt like to be married to a barbarian, a reference to her Janbi heritage. When she reacted with anger, he threatened to marry her off to one of his old slaves. He then, in a drunken stupor, crawled on all fours and knocked over the couch she was sitting on, injuring her. The next day, sober and filled with remorse, he set a huge fire and swore to throw himself into it as penance. He was only stopped when his mother, terrified, forgave him and begged him to live. This was the rhythm of his life: acts of unimaginable horror, followed by brief, lucid moments of profound guilt and theatrical self-loathing, which would inevitably be washed away by the next wave of alcohol. He was a man at war with himself, and he had turned his entire kingdom into the battlefield. The brilliant statesman and the naked beast were two halves of the same soul, and China was trapped in the terrifying space between them. The order he had so carefully built in the early years of his reign was now being systematically dismantled by his own drunken hands. The state was a ship without a captain, adrift on a sea of wine and blood. Our journey returns to Rome, but to a very different city from the one ruled by Commodus. It is now the early 3rd century AD, a time of instability and crisis. The empire is no longer at its peak. It is a fragile, sprawling entity, governed by military strongmen, its traditions eroding under the pressure of constant civil war and foreign influence. And into this uncertain world, a new emperor arrives, a figure so strange, so alien to Roman sensibilities, that he seemed to have stepped out of a myth. He was a 14-year-old boy from Syria, and his name was Elagabalus. He was not Roman by birth. He was a hereditary high priest of the Syrian sun god, Elagabal. He had spent his childhood in the city of Emesa, in a temple filled with the scent of exotic incense, the sound of ecstatic chanting, and the sight of strange, vibrant rituals. His world was one of mysticism, prophecy, and divine communion. He saw himself not as a politician or a general, but as a living incarnation of his God. And then, through a clever and bloody political scheme orchestrated by his ambitious grandmother, Julia Mesa, this provincial priest-king was proclaimed the Emperor of Rome. His arrival in the city was a spectacle of profound cultural shock. The Romans were accustomed to emperors who were soldiers and statesmen, men who embodied the sober, masculine virtues of Roman tradition. What they got was a teenager with kohl-rimmed eyes, rouged cheeks, and draped in the brightly colored silks of an Eastern priest. He did not arrive alone. He brought his God with him. The physical manifestation of Elagabal was not a statue in the Greco-Roman style, but a large, black, conical stone, a meteorite that had been worshipped in Emesa for centuries. Elagabalus entered Rome in a golden chariot, but he rode backwards so that he could face the sacred stone, which was being transported in its own magnificent carriage ahead of him. The Roman people watched in stunned silence. This was not a triumph. It was an invasion, a spiritual conquest of their city by a foreign god and his strange, effeminate boy priest. He immediately set about transforming the religious landscape of Rome, a city with a pantheon of gods and traditions stretching back 1,000 years. His goal was simple and blasphemous: to make his god Elagabal the supreme deity of the Roman Empire, and to subordinate all the old Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, to his Syrian stone. He built a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, the very heart of Roman power, and named it the Elagabalium. He then began to systematically transfer the most sacred objects of Roman religion to this new temple. He took the eternal flame of Vesta, the shields of the Salian priests, the Palladium, objects that were believed to guarantee the very survival of Rome, and placed them in the service of his foreign god. He was not just introducing a new deity, he was attempting to hijack the entire spiritual infrastructure of the empire. He declared himself the chief priest of this new religion and forced the senators, those proud conservative old men who were the guardians of Roman tradition, to participate in his bizarre ceremonies. They were made to watch as he, their emperor, danced around the altar of his black stone, dressed in his silken robes, to the sound of cymbals and drums. He held lavish banquets that were more like surreal theatrical performances than state dinners, where the food was dyed in unnatural colors, and the entertainment was a mix of ecstatic dancing and ritual sacrifice. He was not just ruling Rome, he was trying to remake it into a provincial Syrian temple town, with himself as its divine centerpiece. The Romans, a people who valued order, tradition, and gravitas above all else, were now being ruled by a teenage religious fanatic who saw their entire world as a stage for his personal mystical drama. The reign of Elagabalus was not a period of governance. It was a 4-year performance art piece, a relentless assault on every Roman norm of politics, religion, and gender. The boy emperor, having installed his god, now turned his attention to the human world and began to reshape it with the same chaotic, whimsical energy. He saw the Roman state not as a machine to be managed, but as a toy to be played with, and he populated it with his favorite playthings. He scandalized the Senate by appointing his lovers and cronies to the highest offices of the state. His chariot driver became the commander of the Praetorian Guard. His barber was made the prefect of the grain supply. A dancer named Heracles, who was the emperor's most public and beloved male partner, was given immense power and influence, and Elagabalus even publicly referred to himself as Heracles' queen. He elevated his own grandmother and mother to the Senate, an unprecedented act, and created a women's senate presided over by his mother, which issued decrees on matters of fashion, etiquette, and court protocol. He was systematically dismantling the old patriarchal power structure of Rome and replacing it with a court that resembled a theatrical troupe, where power was determined not by experience or merit, but by the emperor's personal affection. His banquets became the stuff of legend, elaborate spectacles of surreal and often dangerous excess. He would have his guests recline on air-filled cushions that could be deflated at a moment's notice, sending them tumbling to the floor in a heap of confusion. He served dishes made entirely of a single ingredient. One feast featured 60 ostriches, whose brains were served as a delicacy. He organized lotteries, where the prizes ranged from a grand villa to a handful of dead flies. His most infamous, though likely apocryphal, tale was that of a banquet where he decided to surprise his guests with a shower of flowers. He released such a massive quantity of rose and violet petals from a false ceiling that several of his guests were unable to free themselves and suffocated to death, buried under a fragrant, beautiful, and deadly avalanche. His pranks were a constant feature of court life. He would let loose tame leopards and lions among his dinner guests, causing a panic before it was revealed the animals were harmless. He would serve his less favored guests meals made of wax, wood, or ivory, exquisitely crafted to look like real food, and watch with amusement as they struggled to cut into it. He delighted in chaos, in subverting expectations, in turning the solemnity of the imperial court into a never-ending carnival of the absurd. He was also obsessed with collecting things, but his collections were as strange as his rule. He once ordered his soldiers to collect 1,000 pounds of cobwebs from the city of Rome, offering a great reward for the task. When the cobwebs were delivered, he reportedly remarked that from this, one could estimate the greatness of Rome. He held chariot races in his private gardens, but the chariots were pulled not by horses, but by teams of dogs, stags, and even lions. He was a man who lived entirely within the world of his own imagination, a world where flowers could kill, cobwebs were a measure of imperial might, and the most powerful positions in the world were given to dancers and barbers. For 4 years, the Roman Empire was not a political entity. It was a surrealist painting, a bizarre dream from which its people could not wake. The boy from Syria had taken the world's greatest empire and turned it into his personal and ultimately fatal masterpiece of chaos. We return, for the final time, to Rome, but we arrive now in its early imperial age, a time of transition, hope, and profound anxiety. The Republic is dead, its corpse buried under the weight of civil wars. The first emperor, Augustus, has brought peace and stability, but his successor, the gloomy and reclusive Tiberius, has ruled through fear and suspicion. When Tiberius dies in the year 37 AD, the city of Rome holds its breath, and then a wave of pure, unadulterated joy washes over the populace. For the new emperor is a young man they all know and love. He is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the son of the beloved hero Germanicus, a man so adored by the Roman legions and people that he was seen as the true heir to Augustus. The new emperor was known by a childhood nickname, a name given to him by the soldiers his father commanded, who were charmed by the little boy who would stomp around their camps in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny boots. They called him Caligula, which means Little Boot, and when Little Boot became emperor, it felt like a fairy tale come to life. He was young, handsome, and charismatic. He was the embodiment of hope, the promise of a return to a brighter, more open world. His first acts seemed to confirm this promise. He freed citizens who had been unjustly imprisoned by Tiberius. He burned the records of the treason trials that had cast a pall of fear over the city. He paid the generous bequests left by Augustus and Tiberius, which his predecessor had withheld. He staged lavish games and chariot races for the people, showering them with his presence and his generosity. He was everywhere, a vibrant, energetic figure, a stark contrast to the shadowy, reclusive Tiberius. The city fell in love with him. They hailed him as their star, their savior, their glorious prince. For 7 months, the reign of Caligula was a golden age, a citywide festival of relief and adoration. And then he fell ill. It was a serious, life-threatening sickness, perhaps a form of encephalitis. The entire empire plunged into mourning. People gathered in the streets, praying for his recovery, offering their own lives to the gods in exchange for his. And then, a miracle. He recovered. The fever broke, and the emperor returned from the brink of death. But the man who returned was not the same man who had fallen ill. Something in him had broken, or perhaps something had been unlocked. The charming, beloved young prince was gone. In his place was a monster. The illness seemed to have burned away his sanity, leaving behind a cold, glittering core of absolute, terrifying power. The golden age was over. The nightmare was about to begin. The story of Caligula is the story of this transformation, of a man who, having stared into the abyss, decided to pull the entire world in with him. The change in Caligula was not gradual. It was a sudden, terrifying metamorphosis. The man who emerged from his sickbed was a creature of pure, unrestrained ID, a walking embodiment of absolute power, untethered from reason or empathy. He had tasted godlike adoration during his illness, and now he seemed to believe he truly was a god, and he was determined to make the world acknowledge it. His first target was the Roman treasury, which he began to empty with a frenzy of spending that bordered on the insane. He built 2 massive, floating pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, opulent palaces complete with marbled floors, heating systems, and statues, which he used for lavish parties before having them scuttled. He had a 2-mile-long pontoon bridge built across the Bay of Bali, a spectacular and utterly pointless feat of engineering. He then spent 2 days riding his favorite horse, Incitatus, back and forth across the bridge, wearing the supposed breastplate of Alexander the Great, simply to prove a prophecy wrong that had claimed he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the bay. He had staged a miracle for no other reason than to satisfy a personal whim. His relationship with his horse, Incitatus, became one of the defining symbols of his madness. He did not treat him as an animal. He treated him as a high-ranking dignitary. The horse had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, and a collar studded with precious jewels. He had a dedicated staff of servants and was fed oats mixed with gold flake. Caligula would invite Incitatus to dine with him at state banquets and would introduce him to his guests. But his ultimate tribute to his equine friend was the most shocking of all. He announced his intention to appoint Incitatus to the highest office in the Roman Republic, the consulship. Historians debate whether he was serious or if it was a grand, satirical gesture designed to show his contempt for the Senate, to prove that his horse could do their job just as well as they could. But whether it was madness or a cruel joke, the message was the same. The traditions and institutions of Rome were meaningless to him. They were toys in his divine playground. His belief in his own divinity grew more pronounced and more dangerous. He declared himself a living god, Neos Helios, the new sun. He had the heads of famous statues of gods, including the great statue of Zeus at Olympia, removed and replaced with likenesses of his own head. He built a temple to himself in the heart of Rome and established a priesthood to oversee his own worship, a priesthood that included his horse and his favorite uncle, Claudius, whom he forced to pay an exorbitant sum for the honor. He would appear in public, dressed as various gods and goddesses, Hercules, Apollo, Venus, and demand that people worship him on the spot. He built a private bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill to the Temple of Jupiter, so that he could have private consultations with the king of the gods, his brother. His cruelty became as boundless as his ego. He used the treason laws he had once abolished as a tool for extortion and murder, executing wealthy citizens simply to confiscate their estates. His public games became spectacles of horror. He would have criminals thrown to wild beasts during the intermission, a time usually reserved for lighter entertainment. When he ran out of criminals, he reportedly ordered his guards to seize a random section of the audience and have them thrown into the arena instead. He took a perverse pleasure in the suffering of others. He famously complained that his reign was not marked by any great public disaster, like a plague or a military defeat, and he was said to have wished if only the Roman people had a single neck, so that he could sever it with a single blow. He had turned the world's greatest empire into his personal abattoir, a place where the only law was the whim of a mad god who galloped across a pointless bridge on a horse he intended to make a consul. Our journey through the strange corridors of history is now coming to a close. We have walked through the grime of medieval streets, stood in the glittering courts of empresses and hussars, and felt the desert sun on our faces as golden statues turned to watch us pass. We have seen how the immense, crushing weight of absolute power can warp the human mind, turning statesmen into beasts, reformers into tyrants, and kings into fragile men made of glass. These are not just stories of individual madness, they are cautionary tales. They are the echoes of what happens when a single human ego is allowed to become the sole architect of reality for millions. In the quiet, reasoned world of our daily lives, these figures seem like caricatures, like figures from a dark fairy tale, but they were real. Their palaces stood, their decrees were law, and their victims felt real pain. They are the extreme examples of a timeless human story, the struggle between order and chaos, reason and impulse, the self and the state. They remind us that the line between a strong leader and a delusional god can be terrifyingly thin. They show us that the magnificent, solid-seeming structures of civilization are often built on the fragile foundation of a single human mind. And so, as you prepare to drift into sleep, let these stories fade into the background. Let the emperors and their follies, the queens and their ambitions, become distant figures in a dream. They are a part of our shared past, a gallery of portraits that show us the infinite and often terrifying possibilities of what it means to be human. They played their part on the world stage, and now their curtain has fallen. Their worlds of gold and glass, of blood and roses, have long since turned to dust. All that is left is the silence and the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing. Let that rhythm guide you now. Let the noise of the day recede. There are no more decrees to be read, no more empires to be managed. There is only this moment, this quiet and the gentle pull of sleep. Let go of the day. Let the stories dissolve and allow yourself to drift into the peaceful, silent kingdom of your own dreams.